Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. I'm Julie Maxwell Jolly. My background is in education policy and research with a focus on equitable access to learning for all students. I'm very pleased to be part of this webinar on a topic that is so important and a topic in which board members play such an important role. The goal of today's webinar is to provide school board members with information that will help promote a smooth and effective instructional materials adoption process. Today we have some presenters and panelists who are really going to provide you with some great information. Dr. Mike Torres is Director of Curriculum, Frameworks, and Instructional Resources Division at the California Department of Education, and he is also the Executive Director of the IQC. His role at the department includes ensuring that instructional materials submitted for approval by the State Board of Education align with adopted curriculum standards and policies. In his 10 years at CDE, he has spearheaded initiatives on a range of topics, including monitoring and accessibility for special education students. And prior to his work at the department, he taught math and science at the secondary level. So we're very happy to have him today. Dr. Alma Castro is a panelist today. She serves as the president of the Linwood Unified School District Board, the vice president, and she's president of the Los Angeles County School Trustee Association. She served in public schools for over 20 years as a teacher and administrator, and she also teaches at the Cal State Long Beach in their teacher education department. A strong and ongoing focus of Alma's work is on advancing education equity for all students and ensuring that multilingual learners have the support they need to be successful. Dr. Tom Adams he will also be a panelist with us today. He served as a trustee on the Davis Joint Unified School District Board for 8 years until 2022. He was the Deputy Superintendent for Learning and Support at the Department of Education for 22 years, and he's also the former director of the IQC. While he was at the department, he oversaw the adoption of the History and Social Science Project, Social Science Framework, among, I'm sure, many other things that he did while he was there. He's currently a member of the advisory board of the California History Social Science Project, and that's an organization dedicated to providing high quality history instruction with a special focus on English learners and on meeting the needs of native English speakers who are struggling with literacy and on students from economically disadvantaged backgrounds. So as you can see, we have quite a wonderful group with us today. In terms of what we will be doing in today's webinar, we'll do the welcome and introduction, an overview of the state process from Mike Torres, and he will also discuss the requirements of LEAs with regard to instructional materials and provide some guidance in that regard. Then we have a panel with board members Alma Castro and Tom Adams, who will talk about their lived experience in the instructional materials adoption. I will conclude with a few concluding remarks, and then we will go to the Q&A with the full panel. A little housekeeping note. We will save most of the questions and for the question and answer period at the end of the webinar. So if you will please put your questions in the Q&A tab that is at the bottom of your screen, that would be very, very helpful. So as we get started with this, I think it's important to talk about the importance of school board members and how vital they are to the process of instructional review. So we can go to the next slide. So this is a complex and multifaceted process. But again, school boards are really essential. So local boards understand and represent their communities. They know best, they know their communities best. They use data to understand the students in their communities and understand their learning needs. They set goals for materials that meet the LEA and educational vision, and they set that educational vision. They also set policies to ensure that materials provide access for all their students. They allot funding for materials, and very importantly, they also allot funding for the professional development that allows teachers to use those materials most effectively. And then again, the issue of communication, their communication with stakeholders throughout the adoption process is so essential. So in addition to this webinar, I just want to mention that CSBA has other resources in the form of a brief and fact sheets on the instructional materials adoption process. And in those materials, there are links to sample board policies. So moving on to a little bit of background about instructional materials. It's important to start with the definition of what we mean by instructional materials and emphasize their importance to student learning and teacher instruction. So I'm going to read here from the California Education Code, which defines instructional materials as, quote, all materials that are designed for use by pupils and their teachers as a learning resource to help pupils to acquire facts, skills, or opinions, or to develop cognitive processes. Instructional materials may be printed or non-printed and may include textbooks, technology-based materials, and other educational materials and tests. So instructional materials are very central to student learning, and there's a wealth of research that confirms that fact and the fact that they can have that significant impact. Just to provide one example, a large-scale study comparing different types of math books found that students using high-quality curriculum materials in math made significant gains over those who were using less high-quality materials. And very importantly, those students maintained that advantage over time. There's also research that indicates a positive impact on student outcomes when they use materials that reflect their diversity. And obviously, we know how important that is in California, where we have such a wide range of geographic, demographic, linguistic, and cultural backgrounds among our students. And then finally, policy researchers note that high quality curriculum materials are what they call a cost neutral investment, because high quality materials are generally no more expensive than lower quality materials. So with that, I will turn it over to Dr. Mike Torres, who will join us on camera and will give us a wealth of information about the state processes and the instructional materials adoption process. So Mike, thank you.
Thank you so much, Julie, and I appreciate the introduction and also the opportunity to speak here and share about the standards, frameworks, and instructional materials at the state level. I'm going to move on to my short agenda for what I'm going to talk about. I will be covering very briefly the Instructional Quality Commission. I'll talk about that interconnectedness between content standards, frameworks, and model curricula, and to instructional materials and accessible materials, finally concluding with some guidance around instructional materials. So jumping off to Instructional Quality Commission. This commission is a state board of education advisory body. So they're not a policy-making group, rather they are the experts that provide advice and guidance to the State Board of Education on all things related to curriculum and instruction. They do advise and they make recommendations to the state board on implementation of the state's academic content standards that have been adopted by that state board. They develop and recommend curriculum frameworks and model curricula. I'll talk a little bit more about what those are and how they're different from each other. They also develop and recommend the criteria for evaluating instructional materials, and that can be found within the curriculum frameworks. And then they evaluate instructional materials and they make recommendations to either adopt or reject submitted instructional materials for statewide adoption. Now I'm going to jump into standards. All guidance, frameworks, and instructional materials must reinforce the state-adopted content standards. These standards are considered the what for instruction, and they outline what students should know, understand, and be able to do by the end of a grade level and by the end of their school career in general. They provide that foundational instructional materials as well as the basis for assessments. Content guidance, including frameworks developed after 2010, do draw on the literacy standards outlined in the California Common Core State Standards for English Language Arts Literacy, which does include standards in foundational skills and literacy development. Just a little bit more about standards on the next slide. On the left-hand side, you'll see a link to where you can find a listing of all the different content standards that the State Board of Education has adopted over the years. On the right-hand side, there's a listing of the different content areas and the years in which each of those standards were adopted. You'll notice the most recent standards were adopted in world languages and arts education in 2019. The mathematics, which everyone is very interested in lately, is the California Common Core State Standards adopted in 2010. And then the oldest would be our history social science standards, last adopted in 1998. Now, standards are not updated on a regular cycle. It takes an act of legislation and funding in order to begin to redevelop or redesign standards. So this list will stay static until a piece of legislation is enacted to update standards, which will start the whole ball rolling for frameworks and then eventually new instructional materials, which we'll talk about here on the next slide. So frameworks and model curricula then say the how to teach to those standards. What are those best practices to meet the needs of students while following and aligned to standards? Frameworks do provide specifications for the publishers as well in order how to develop materials that reflect the standards and the research-based practices that are then highlighted within those frameworks. Frameworks are organized by grade level or grade span and do include chapters such as chapters on assessment, instructional strategies, and professional learning. They also include classroom examples and supporting materials and appendices. Whereas model curricula then are more focused. They're like a framework. They do expand on practical examples that are provided within the framework, but they're more focused on a specific element or set of standards within a larger content area. Take ethnic studies, for example, which is born out of the history social science standards. Of course, this guidance, whether it's a model curriculum or a framework, is not a mandate. It's not required, but educators may know about research and support that the frameworks do provide already. They're not necessarily required to use these frameworks to build and refine courses or provide professional learning, but that resource is available and it's out there for use. The next slide has a few examples of covers for some of our model curricula and our ethnic studies model curriculum, as well as our ELA, ELD, and our former mathematics framework. We are currently working on the new cover for the 2023 adopted mathematics framework. And so we're within a couple of months of being able to release that professionally edited and designed. Until then, we went with the graphic for the previous framework here. Moving along, I'm going to talk about instructional materials, which I know is the main focus of this webinar, these school board members here present who would like to learn more about that. Instructional materials are the tools with which then teachers are able to help their students develop literacy and mastery of the subject and grade-specific standards within multiple content areas that we have standards and frameworks within. The California adopted math and ELA, ELD instructional materials are then certified to meet California Common Core state standard requirements, as well as the state board adopted social content standards and the best practices in instruction. Moving on to the next slide, the State Board of Education has the constitutional responsibility and authority to adopt instructional materials in grades 1 through 8 pursuant to Ed Code listed on the top of the slide. That's Article 9, Section 7.5, actually of the California Constitution. But they also have statutory authority to adopt instructional materials for kindergarten. There are no statewide adoptions for content areas within grades 9 through 12. The frameworks do give direction to publishers and content developers by providing the criteria for evaluating instructional materials for those associated content areas. Now, instructional materials were defined earlier by Julie, but I do want to emphasize that instructional materials can include more than just traditional textbooks. And adoption can include basic programs that cover a year-long course of study. So note that statewide adoptions do not include supplemental materials that cover just a specific lesson or units. Rather, they are full year-long courses of study. Instructional materials do serve as the primary mode of access for California students to the state standards-based content and the knowledge and skills that they are then expected to master. Instructional materials do support teachers in making instructional decisions and selecting effective teaching strategies that lead to student mastery of the content standards. The next slide has an example of a schedule of significant events, actually, which was adopted by the state board in January of this year, specifically for the mathematics adoption. This slide highlights a few of those key dates, such as currently we're in the reviewer application period that started last month in April. That will be open until September of 2024. The IQC will review those applications, make recommendations to the state board, who will appoint reviewers in January of 2025. The appointed reviewers will be trained at the end of April of 2025. Instructional material programs will be submitted to the state to be disseminated to reviewers in May, and then those reviewers will have the summer to review the instructional programs that they've been assigned to. They'll come back together again and discuss their findings as they evaluated the programs in July. We anticipate this being one of the largest adoptions our division has ever undertaken. So we are planning to hold 2 separate weeks for deliberations because of the large number of programs submitted. Eventually, the IQC will then make their program recommendations in September of 2025 for state board to then consider in November of 2025. So on the next slide, I'll start talking about LEA adoption requirements. You may wonder, all right, so that's the standards to frameworks to instructional materials, but what are the requirements for the local educational agency for that school district? So the state board does create that list of highly vetted instructional materials for LEAs to choose from, but there is Ed Code 60210 that does allow LEAs to use materials that are not adopted by the State Board of Education. And here on this slide, you have statutory language about how LEA must conduct their local reviews. And that's the reviews to be conducted by a majority of subject and grade relevant classroom teachers. And regardless of whether an LEA wants to use state board adopted materials or not, Education Code requires that local governing boards take formal action to adopt a program, whether it's on the list or not. Next slide, I have a little bit more information about LEA adoptions, regardless of whether the LEA desires to use State Board of Ed adopted materials or not. But there's other law that does stipulate aspects of the local selection process, that the local governing board must provide for substantial teacher involvement and promote the involvement of parents and other members of the community when it comes to the consideration of and selection of instructional materials. The next slide has a couple of other considerations, and that would be instructional materials sufficiency, also known as Williams, that requires that the 4 core subjects that students have access to instructional materials in both the classroom and to take home, and that the materials are aligned to State Board of Ed adopted content standards. Additionally, there's also social content laws that are designed to ensure that the materials that students use portray accurately and equitably the cultural and racial diversity of American society, and that the materials demonstrate the contributions of persons of all genders and of all minority groups, and emphasize that all peoples in varied, positive, and contributing roles. These laws also forbid advertising in certain materials. As I move to conclude this presentation, I'd like to finish with some guidance that we have out to the field for consideration for local adoptions. So this here on this slide, you have the front cover of the guidance for local instructional materials adoptions. That's lovingly referred to as the GLIMA. That was recently adopted by the board in March of this year. The document includes a comprehensive deep dive into the instructional materials adoption process and includes important statutory citations. The guidance supports school districts from the beginning of the adoption process to the end. Just some key points would be, begins with identifying instructional materials for review based on what the local priorities are for that school district. The act of reviewing selected materials for standards alignment, instructional practices, and specifically support for targeted student groups, which I know our panel will be talking about here in just a moment. Also about conducting a pilot where the materials are used in the classroom. What does it mean to reach consensus when deliberating on instructional materials and adopting them? And finally, creating an implementation plan to support a smooth transition to the use of those materials. On the next slide, just a couple more key points that when choosing instructional materials to review, it's important to note that those materials must be aligned at each grade level to standards, that there must be a focus on local priorities. So whether it's the GLIMA provides support, whether it's examining LCAP goals, looking at specific student achievement data that's local, assessing the strengths and needs with any current curriculum, and discussing what kind of technology and digital learning needs are in a program and if those resources are available. And then ultimately, community involvement is a key best practice in instructional materials adoptions. The next slide includes a few more bullet points on student groups that should be considered when conducting a local instructional materials adoption. The GLIMA does provide support on determining and evaluating how well an instructional material program meets the needs of English learners or meets the needs of students with disabilities, and inclusive of universal design for learning. And there's a whole section within the GLIMA to help support that. The next slide just has a couple of snapshots. On the left-hand side, you'll see a snapshot out of the GLIMA supporting the needs of English learners and students with disabilities. And then on the right side, supporting the needs of English learners, listing priorities and an opportunity for rating. Additionally, something new specifically for mathematics is the GLIMA is inclusive of how to adapt standards maps for big ideas. As you know, the mathematics framework is centered around big ideas. It's a congregation of smaller of standards into like ideas that all have meaning behind it. Instructional materials programs can use the big ideas from the mathematics framework, or they can be centered around major conceptual ideas, some other grouping of standards that makes sense. And so the GLIMA does provide some guidance on ways in which standards maps can be redesigned so that review teams can take into consideration that instructional materials are centered around major conceptual ideas or those big ideas. The next figure includes a template for considering, similar to the big ideas, the mathematics framework, both the previous and the current, focus heavily on the standards for mathematical practice. And so this slide includes an example of what that might look like in a local adoption. The next slide has an example of checking grade level content standards using a specific example of fourth grade standards. And then my final slide shows the flow chart of instructional materials selection. So a proposed decision tree that a local school district can use when determining whether or not they want to proceed with piloting and subsequently moving forward and adopting a set of instructional materials, whether it's on the approved list or not. So that's in a nutshell the standards to curriculum framework to instructional materials adoption process, as well as some new guidance that the CDE and the State Board of Education has provided to school districts for local adoptions. With that, thank you for your time, and I pass the presentation back over to Julie.
Thank you so much, Mike. That was a lot of information. And something I neglected to say at the outset is that all the webinar participants will receive a link to the slides. And so all of that information, as well as the links that Mike provided, that's something that webinar participants will receive. So if our panelists will join us on camera now, our panelists will, oh, I see I've got my chat is hiding the camera. They'll provide us with some information based on their own experience in the adoption process. And so, Alma, starting with you, my first question is for both of you, but if you'll start, Alma, and this is kind of an overview, big picture question, and that is, what did you learn from your experience in adopting instructional materials that you'd like to share and pass on to other board members? And both in terms of what went well and what you might do differently.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, CSBA, for the opportunity to share about our experience. As a school board member for Linwood Unified School District, we recently, and in recent years, I want to say, went through an adoption process of the science adoption and adopted in late fall of 2022 our science curricular instructional materials. And so a few of the learnings, I really appreciate listening deeply to Dr. Mike Torres and talking about the opportunity, right? The opportunity we have right now to design materials that reflect the diversity of our students and serve those rich linguistic, cultural assets and intellectuals of our students. So what we learned is the adoption is a process. Meaning that it's really important to design a thoroughly and thoughtful plan from beginning to from various steps, right? I know that in our district we have our education services department that created a plan with various steps from what is the information we currently have to designing a committee that would take the charge, that was primarily teacher-led with the support of directors and district office staff and administration, but a committee composed of professionals with diverse backgrounds, expertise, and those that would represent all of our students. So we know that in the process, we started our process right before the pandemic for the science adoption 2020. And because this was a process, we took a pause. We moved from in-person process to then during the pandemic, online, and that created some challenges. So we took a pause, but we did reconvene in 2021, 2022, and finally our Board of Education approved the instructional materials. We also learned the importance of communication between committee members, our staff, district office, and that transparency with our community as well, with our parents, with our educational partners, and ensuring that there's inclusiveness of all voices.
Thank you, Alma. Can you answer the same question, Tom? What you learned from
Sure.
your experience and what you would do the same and differently?
Well, first of all, I just
If
want
anything.
yeah, I want to build on Alma's comments. Those are really good. Just keep in mind, design the process for the results that you want. And that's important in all this. And so one of the things I think you want to do as a board member is review your LCAP goals and make sure the goals of your adoption are aligned with your LCAP. That's crucial. I would also say ask staff to explain before the process gets going, ask staff to explain what it is and do so at a board meeting and how people can be part of the process and what are the points of participation. And then also another major point I think is the materials really need to be piloted in the classroom. Don't rely on a committee that doesn't use them in the classroom. And what I found important, say in our most recent adoption in Davis, was when we did the history social science adoption. This can be a very potential controversial area. But what was important is we had data of how the teachers and the students reacted to the text. And this is, so in that sense, people didn't, understood.
It looks like we may be having a moment of technical difficulty here.
Julie, as Tom is coming back, and I know
Yeah.
I'll close my
Oh,
mic.
there he
Oh,
is.
here he is.
There you are, Tom. We lost you for a moment. Tom, we lost you for a moment.
Yeah, I don't know what happened there, but
So maybe if you could go back 60 seconds.
so I'm not sure if I talked about if I got on there about teacher and student data and the importance of it and how that is crucial to helping people understand the learning that will happen in the classroom with the new materials.
All right, great. Thank you so much. I just have to say I'm learning a lot from this, from what I'm hearing from you all, so that's great. So although you touched on this somewhat, I wondered if you could share how you ensure that the materials address the needs of the diverse students in your LEAs, including English learners and students with disabilities. And maybe, Tom, you can go first this time.
Well, first of all, hopefully everyone now is using the concept of universal design for learning and MTSS. And we all know that the most important thing for all our students is to get good instruction at the beginning. But what is crucial in terms of English learners and students with disabilities is that they are part of core instruction. So you have to make sure the materials ensure that those students will be part of instruction in the core classroom throughout the day. This doesn't mean they don't get supports or things like that, but they have to be considered as part of the program, and that they're just not relegated to pullouts and things like that. I think the other thing is you have to know your student population. Even if you have, say, a high percentage of English learners, you have to know the different types of English learners, their backgrounds and where they're coming from, and what materials will really speak to them. The other thing I found out in this process was you also have the materials that are flexible for use by homeless students and foster youth, because portability is a big issue for them. I still remember the case of talking to one teacher friend, and she said, when we went digital, a lot of my foster students really improved for the simple reason they could take their curriculum with them. They didn't have a heavy textbook to lug around. They could actually bring it with them and work on the computer and actually complete their work. So in this sense, you want to be able to think about all these people who are involved. But I would just say also when it comes to English learner groups and other parents who might be hesitant to participate in the system, don't wait for them to come to the process. Go to them. And that's what we found was really effective. Go to either your existing committees, reach out to them directly, because some of them are just hesitant to become involved in these process. So reach out to them.
Thank you. Amma, did you have something to add there?
You know, Tom, those are really great points. I'd like to just build a little bit on the data piece. And we know that our students or schools have changed in many ways with diversity in demographics and needs, right? And I really appreciate, Tom, how you shared the different assets of our students, linguistically, culturally, and some of the areas where we can continue to support our students in homeless and foster youth. We also have our students with interrupted formal education. And, you know, it's important as we're looking at these instructional materials that we spend some time in that. I appreciate how you said, Tom, the design a process for the results that we want, right? So in that design process, a deep dive into the data of our students, looking at the percentage of students who are English language learners and breaking that down to our newcomer students, to our long-term ELs. I also think it's, you know, to ensure that these materials meet the needs of diverse students, we in Linwood have used a rubric, and I know that during the science adoption, we have an element or a segment in the rubric that speaks to supporting students with diverse learning needs. And another section in our rubric, and I apologize, I'm looking at my notes here, that speaks to equitable learning opportunities, looking at culturally relevant contexts and examples that support all students. So I think in a more systemic way, when we're looking at how do we address the needs of the diverse student populations that we serve, it's really critical to create, to design, to look at that our rubrics have these different populations included, and that when we are having committee members trained and calibrated, that we're looking at, it almost feels like there's this crossover of various information points, right? But from the data of our students to the expertise lens of our teachers that are participating not only with their expertise area of the student, but from grade level spans as well.
Thank you so much. So you both mentioned the importance of communication. And I'm wondering, this is a little bit of a nuts and bolts question, but how you managed input from the range of stakeholders, including parents, community members, and educators. So I think it's you first this time, Alma.
Thank you, Julie. Yes, communication is key. And when there's lack of communication, a limited communication, there's a lot of concern and a lot of question. I think one of the key areas for communication is our committee members are those ambassadors to take back that information to our different school sites through department meetings, through staff meetings and different areas. So that's one entry point for communication. But I also believe that the opportunity where we have the public viewing, and I know, Tom, you touched a little bit on this, on how teachers, can come back with feedback once they go through this piloting process, right? And how important it is to also create a plan for communication, and how will we enlist our students as part of this plan so that we can hear from the voices of the students that are doing the learning and the teachers that are piloting some of this work. And of course, communication, Tom, you shared about asking staff to provide information, I think, through board presentations. But I know in my community we also do board study sessions that have been very important and critical in learning a little deeper and asking, questions and building off from each other as well as we're learning through this process.
Tom, do you want to share about that important
Yeah, so
issue?
I want to echo all those comments. So those were great. But it's also important that you give parents an environment that they are used to talking in, and so in that sense, one of the things we often do is we show up at the ELAC committee, English Learner Advisory Committee, and we talk about things there. We will go to say a school or PTA or PTO if you have a PTO, and talk there. Keep in mind, I think almost right, you got to have a communication plan from the beginning all the way to the end. You got to announce to people saying, hey, we're going to start looking at new science materials or history, social science materials, or what will be likely in the next couple of years, math materials. You just it doesn't hurt to repeat yourself often in communication, is what I found. But I think also you as a board member have to be, you have to take certain things that you hear in the community and pose it as a question for your superintendent and your colleagues. So if you're at a public forum, let's say it's elementary materials and you hear parents asking questions and raising concerns, you can actually go to your colleagues and superintendents, hey, I was at this forum, I heard this issue. Let me know how we're addressing it. That way you're being the voice of their concerns, but you're also doing it so in a manner that you hopefully get the informed response that you want. And yet they get a sense that you're talking about these issues at a board meeting. And I would also just say, remember, just get a lot of help from your friends, as Ringo Starr's saying. Many people will want to help you and do things, and so be available to them, offer to go there. Don't wait for the grocery store meeting to talk about things. Go out and talk to them ahead of time. And remember, in the end, I would just say, in terms of your personal views of curriculum, whatever they are, just hold on to them, because really at the end of the process, you will have your voice. And as a board member, it's big and loud. So be careful how you adjust the volume. You don't want to turn everything up to 11, but just remember you have a powerful voice in all this, but that power should be used for all those who often don't feel that they're part of the process.
Really, such great advice from both of you. So a final question is just if you have any additional advice to board members and school districts that are or will be going through the materials adoption process. And it's to you first this time, Tom.
Well, I will talk about one experience I had early in my board tenure. Everybody in town knew who I was and what I brought to the board in terms of my knowledge. And a curriculum issue came up, and my colleagues, my fellow trustees were talking about it, and they looked at me and they said, Tom, what do you think about this? And I said, well, I think this. And they said, oh, well, then let's just go with what Tom says. And I realized, oh, that's not what I wanted to do, right? I don't want my colleagues just to follow me because I'm an expert in the area. I want them to think through the issues. And so that's when I realized I have to use my background and expertise to help create a conversation, not end one, right? To deepen it, to make sure that we all have a consensus based upon a shared understanding. And I think that's what you want to do as a board member. Always keep asking the questions. Even if you know the answer, it's good often to hear the discussion happen among your colleagues and with the superintendent and staff. And I think that's what you really want to do as a board member, create a consensus based upon a shared understanding.
Thank you. Alma, you have something to add there?
Yes, and I would add as well as the opportunities to build on the resources that we have that are shared by the California Department of Education, as well as county offices of education, often provide additional resources and opportunities for partnership. I know that there are many other resources through universities. One other area I'd like to add is for recommendation. We talked about communication and just being very mindful, aware of the various languages that are spoken in our communities. And Tom, I really appreciate how you shared going to these different committees, right? ELAC, DLAC, and the different committees to present to parents and conduct presentations or acquire the resources necessary to conduct those presentations in languages where parents can genuinely feel that they have a voice and that they can participate. I also would like to share that, in part of this work, I know Dr. Mike Torres shared a great resource that we have used a few minutes ago, which is the Instructional Material Selection Decision Tree. And it really helps you reflect on where you are with respect to the process and how might you need to pivot or make some adjustments to continue through the process until the implementation. And Julie, you recently contributed to CSBA a piece that I'd like to share. It's the Instructional Materials Adoption, the State and Local Governing Board Process, Roles, and Responsibility, published in February 2024. What I found very useful was also the questions that were provided in this piece, which were questions for school board members to consider, looking at whether or not our school board members have a plan for reviewing the responsibilities and also for engaging in the adoption of materials. So I would say that, as a closing, the advice is find entry points to engage, create entry points to engage in the process, and spend some time to thoroughly and thoughtfully plan and design, having in mind the populations and the students with disabilities, English language learners, and all of the diverse students we serve, and bridging on their assets.
Thank you. Thank you both so much. That is all really, really helpful information. I'm sure that the webinar participants are really appreciating this information that you're providing. So moving on now to just a few concluding remarks. I'd like to say a little bit about the current context and the importance of instructional materials in the current context. So one thing we know is that state revenues are not what we have expected them to be and not what they were in a few past years. So that means that every education dollar is extremely precious, and that spending on proven tools like quality instructional materials is a wise investment. Unfortunately, state accountability data indicates that students have not caught up in terms of their learning growth to pre-pandemic levels, and that this is more pronounced for some groups. So again, instructional materials, very important and helpful in that regard. Chronic absenteeism has increased. I know we've all been reading about this, and PACE has put out some data that this chronic absenteeism is up to about 25%. And this means that teachers are likely to have students in their classrooms who are catching up. You know, almost every day, every teacher is likely to have a student who needs help with catching up on material they've missed. So instructional materials are important there. Many classrooms currently are staffed by substitutes. The CCTC indicates there are about 10,000 teacher vacancies. We also have a number of teachers who will be eligible for retirement in the next couple of years, and there are fewer teachers entering credential programs. So all of that means, even with declining enrollment, I think all of that means that we're going to have more teachers in classrooms who are substitute teachers. And while instructional materials cannot take the place of a well-prepared teacher, they are certainly helpful for those who are in classrooms who haven't had the advantage of a teacher education program. And then finally, we have 2 new content implementations on the horizon. As Mike mentioned, there will be materials for the new math materials probably in 2025. And then the high school ethnic studies implementation will take place in 25-26. And it's important to note that because the State Board of Education does not adopt materials at the secondary level, all of those materials adoptions will be local. And then finally, before we get to the Q&A, I just want to mention a few things that might be helpful in terms of minimizing conflict in this instructional materials adoption process. Given the diversity of views among parents, guardians, board members, educators, and other stakeholders, some disagreement is about the best approach to student learning is expected, but there are steps that boards can take to help with that. And I just have to say, based on what our panelists shared with us, I think the first thing to say is communication, communication, communication. Obviously, that is really important. And communicating clear and ongoing explanation, including of the legal obligations with regard to instructional materials. That can help community members understand why particular materials are chosen and what makes those chosen materials the best choice for the students in a particular LEA. Boards can ensure inclusiveness among reviewers. So of teachers from different backgrounds with different expertise, as well as community members and others, and include those in the review process. They can ensure that all stakeholders have ample opportunities to ask questions and to provide comments. And that goes, I think, to the implementation plan that both Tom and Alma mentioned, making sure that you have ample time and a plan for all of this communication. Then piloting materials so that teachers can provide information and students can provide information about their effectiveness, and then sharing that piloting information with the community, again, so that folks in the community understand why particular materials have been chosen. And so I don't know if Tom or Alma, you'd like to add anything to that before we move to the Q&A. If so, please chime in. And if not, we will go ahead and open it up to questions from the webinar participants. And I will open the Q&A here. And also, I just want to thank, yes, thank you to Mike, everybody joining us on camera. And I want to thank everyone. This has really been good information for me too. So let's see. I'm going to look at these questions and see if I can answer them. So to what extent should the board be involved in the selection of supplemental instructional materials that may be used by individual teachers? I'm not going to read the whole, I think that's the essence of the question. Is that something that you could take, Mike? That seems like a question perhaps for you.
So thank you, Julie, for that. Anonymous attendee for asking the question.
Yes.
Yeah, so as I mentioned before, the statewide adoptions are kindergarten through grade 8. And they're for basic programs that include the full course of study, the full year course of study. So supplemental materials are not part of the statewide instructional materials adoption. Subsequently, any kind of supplemental materials, just like the adopted materials themselves, are all under the purview of the local governing board. So whatever policies that local governing board has, it's really up to them how they want to handle both course year-long instructional materials, whether they're on the list or not, as well as supplemental materials. I hope that's helpful. And then I'm not sure if Alma or Tom have any insight into that question as well.
All right. The next question, I think probably all of you have something to contribute in this next question, is that it is regarding the adoption process for high school elective courses that may involve textbooks or other materials. What comments do you have to make about that?
So I can
And Mike,
start
maybe
off.
starting with you again. Yeah.
Yeah, so yeah, as you mentioned, in grade 9 through 12 is not part of the statewide instructional materials adoptions. On our CDE webpage, we actually do have a listing and some resources available to you in addition to the GLIMA that I referred to earlier. We do have standards maps for grades 9 through 12 that can be used as part of local adoptions. These standards maps are also board adopted, and I'm happy to share a link to you, Julie, and to share out with participants here on where they can find these standards maps. But essentially, the GLIMA itself used to be a very short, about 10-page document that just talked about education code related to the local adoption of instructional materials. And since then, we've revamped it to this much, much longer, much more in-depth guidance for local adoptions, which can be specifically used for grades 9 through 12, since there are no state board adopted materials there. Within there's sample templates for standards maps. There's sample templates for summary tally sheets. There's sample language for the consideration and evaluation of needs of English learners and students with disabilities. So there's a plethora of different resources available on that document that can be used for ethnic studies. It can be used for 9-12. It can be used for any electives. So basically anything that has not been adopted by the state board, and we want to do a thorough local adoption of.
So I believe in the brief that CSBA has published, there's a link to those standards maps. There's information about those, and yes, they are very, very complete. Did either of you want to add anything about a secondary, Alma or Tom, about secondary material, adopting secondary materials? Move on. Okay, so.
Can I just add something about
yeah,
secondary? So
please.
just keep in mind, as a board member, you are it is a different atmosphere at high school. You are dealing with not grade levels, but departments. And these people often have degrees or advanced degrees in those subject areas. So that will change your interaction. The other thing to keep in mind is some high school courses get very specific about certain matters, whether it be AP or other CTE courses or things like that. So just keep in mind, the picture gets a bit more complicated at the high school level, but that doesn't mean your concerns and LCAP goals shouldn't be part of the discussion in the selection of high school materials.
Thank you. The next question is about, it goes to you again, Mike. As part of the state board's recommendations for high quality instructional materials, will assessments also be identified?
So there are, for the curriculum frameworks, there is an assessment chapter that talks about best practices for assessment. It's hard to tell from the question if they're talking about formative classroom assessments or statewide summative assessments, so I'll speak very briefly to both. The curriculum framework includes information on assessments that would be in the classroom, that would be part of the textbook, part of that adoption process. So there are best practices there. As far as statewide summative assessment, just know that the California Assessment for Student Performance and Progress, specifically the Smarter Balanced English Language Arts, ELD, and mathematics assessments are all based on standards. And just note the standards have not changed. The curriculum framework has changed, which is the guidance on how to teach to those standards. But since the assessment is based on the standards and those have not changed, so there is no current plan to change the statewide assessment. So that's kind of a twofold answer to that question.
Thank you, Mike. I think this next question would go to board members. I'm curious, this person asks, I'm curious to understand if anyone has adopted, or I just lost the question, an ethnic studies adoption, and what you share if you have gone through that process.
In Linwood, I know we have not. We do offer it as an elective, and of course, we engage the voices of our educators, but we have not had an adoption process yet.
And
Right,
I would say in Davis, we have begun the process, and I was on the board and the examining of course descriptions and adopting those, and some summer pilots that we did, which are important in all this. But I would say this is one area where you want to bring everyone along. It's important that everyone understand what is being taught there. And it's crucial that you look at evidence and avoid labels. That's one thing that, when we had people visit the summer school pilot, they were impressed what students were learning and how deep they were going with the issues, and how much they were motivated on their own to learn.
thank you. Well, okay, here's a question that is a tough one. What do you do when a group of parents is vehemently against, I'm assuming against it, so I'm assuming instructional materials, and raising concerns? One of our local school boards absolutely dismissed parent concerns. So Tom and Alma, would you like to address that? What I think this would be maybe about, communication techniques, perhaps.
Yes, Julie, and I was going to build on that, on how important it is, from beginning to, as Tom stated, right, from beginning to end, having a clear plan of communication, of starting the process, of where we are in the process. And then, of course, designing entry points for input, so that if, midpoint there are concerns, we are able to address them. We are able to create opportunities for stakeholder or educational partners to provide those concerns, through, whether it's through meetings as a team or through individual meetings with those stakeholders. I think one of the problems or concerns with the that are brought up is it's a length of time, and the communication is is fractured, and people have questions in between the process, because it is a long process. So I think to address those stakeholder concerns, it's again, create opportunities throughout the process where various stakeholders can provide input, and then you can go back and address some of those concerns midway.
And I would just add to that. Thank you, Alma. That's really good advice. I would just add, always make sure that they understand you are listening. You have to, as a board member, you're up there and you represent all parents. At the same time, you also have certain statutory duties to do in terms of providing students with instructional materials in a timely manner that's consistent with the content and cycles of the standards and frameworks. I mean, these are things, but I would also try and also understand what is the real concern underneath it all. And I think that's why it's important, as Alma said, to get out there, talk to them, sit down with them, hear what their concerns really are. And, maybe those concerns can be allayed with the proposed materials. I would also say that, never be afraid to communicate. I mean, this is crucial to our work as trustees. And to also, though, keep in mind, ultimately, what is your goal as a trustee? And what goals has the community decided on already and wants this adoption process to advance?
Thank you. Those are very, very important, important questions. So let's see. I'm having a little bit of technical difficulty. Okay, here we go. There's a question here about the process for the state determining which instructional materials will be included in the list of recommended materials, and that really goes through the whole process. So I think, Mike, that's something that's included in the materials that you have provided, but is there something that you would like to say about that? Just a little summary.
Sure, yeah. And so I see the second part to the question is there a process for providers to submit their materials to the state? Absolutely.
Right.
So we've held shortly after the instructional materials schedule of significant events and the intent to hold an adoption were approved by the state board. The department held several publisher-related webinars, which are all posted on our webpage. If you search for math adoption, the links to those are all available for the target audience, again, is publishers, on what to expect, what are the next steps as they produce instructional material programs. But ultimately, the short answer, because I can talk forever on this, the short answer to the question is that there will be in January 2025, there'll be a publisher intent to submit webinar that will get more into the weeds on how to submit and by when submissions need to be made. And that commitment essentially is made once that intent to submit is conducted. So more information on that to come in January 2025, but there are some sneak peeks within the publisher materials.
Very good, thank you. And then there's a question here about can you address how to handle the critical needs for replacing ELA books in classrooms and libraries for our TK3 students in order to be consistent with science of reading versus leveled books that are no longer appropriate for young learners? It's kind of a technical question, but Mike, do you have some comments to make about that?
Yeah, the purchase and usage of books in a library are all, again, a local decision based on whatever the local board policies are. The state superintendent did publish middle of last year some guidance on our webpage on the removal and the consideration of removal of instructional materials or books from libraries. That is of specific interest, specifically around educational rights of students and representation within what they have available to them. So that's available for view. But I guess the bottom line is it really is ultimately up to the state, not state, the local governing board, as long as that they follow all rules and statute as far as what materials are within libraries and not.
Okay, thank you. How about, again, this seems like it would go to you, Mike. How many districts are experiencing parental skepticism about screen time and technology that is attached to curricula?
I wish I had an answer to that one.
That's a good one. Oh.
It is a great question. I mean, it's a question that I struggled with myself with my own kids growing up, is how much screen time is too much. And then here I am on Zoom all day, and then in the evening time on my computer, my personal computer. So screen time is definitely an issue. That's my, again, long-winded way of saying I don't know. There hasn't been any kind of information formally shared with the department. There hasn't been information gathering about and related to screen time and technology that's attached to curriculum. That would be a consideration for the local school district when they conduct their local adoption, if that is a concern within their local community. And that would be part of that outreach to interest holders and find out what is important, not only to the educators, but to the parents, the students, and others of what components would be part of that particular curriculum.
Yeah, I think that's a question that we're all dealing with in all aspects of our lives right now, right? And I don't have the kid issue, but I have the grandkid issue, so I'm experiencing that as well. All right. Can anyone speak to College Board age requirements and the competing need for resources between the core curriculum versus AP curriculum? For example, World History text versus AP World History text. It says, and I don't know if any of you have a comment that you can make on that. Okay, then moving on. With the long delay in the math adoption, again, this is going to go to you, Mike, will there be any partial guidance for beginning the transition to big ideas of mathematics across the grades?
That is a great question. Absolutely. So one of the recent publisher webinars that we held, and again, the target audience was for publishers, but it is helpful information for educators, parents, school board members who are interested in mathematics and the math framework and how it's different. We did touch upon guidance around developing programs around the big ideas. So we know that there are some LEAs out there who don't buy boxed curriculum, who create their own. And so there is guidance out there within that publisher webinar that would be helpful. In addition to that, the State Board of Education did adopt the standards maps for the upcoming mathematics adoption back in January. Those standards maps are available upon request. So if you send an email, go to the CDE math adoption page and send an email to our team, we would be more than happy to send out standards maps to you that publishers would be using and subsequently instructional material reviewers will be using. And those standards maps are organized around the big ideas. So that's another way that that an LEA could have an additional resource when making that transition to big ideas rather than a laundry list of standards for mathematics.
Julie, if I could just add on to that.
Yes, please do.
Well, first of all, we should congratulate Mike on doing such a great framework with mathematics. You know, that was it's really rich innovations there, Mike. Really like the framework. But getting back to our audience, as board members, you might want to advocate for teachers getting early professional development on the big idea. So it's not a new, strange things when the materials show up. I would also say as a board member, you probably want to sit down with your assistant superintendent of instruction and learning and walk through some of those teaching vignettes in the math framework. In fact, that would be a great study session to build on Alma's idea, right? Just so how does the math framework address English learners in math? Something we haven't been too good about before, and this is how's it going to change instruction? There's a lot of good new material that even if you aren't, quote, a math person, you can really learn a lot about math instruction and how things will change in the new classroom and with the new curriculum. So don't wait for the materials to show up. There are a lot of good practices there that you can start tomorrow.
Julie,
Great
and
advice.
if
Yes,
I can just
please.
add, I'll add,
Yes.
something that came to mind was also is as we're advocating for additional professional development or early on professional development, I think, Tom, you mentioned earlier how important it is to plan through LCAP funding. And as we're, allocating through our funding for professional development, board members, we can also engage in advocacy and identifying funding for this different type of professional development for our educators and our administrators.
That's great. Great advice from all of you. So we just have a couple more questions. One is, do districts publish a list of what they're adopting during the year or 3 years, the LCAP cycle? I feel surprised, this person feels surprised when the curriculums come for board approval. And this person feels like they don't really get notice and the process seems kind of hidden. So I think this may be for you board members. Do you have a comment or some suggestions about that? Okay.
I'm sorry, Julie.
Well, I'll just
Yeah.
add something. So first of all, I remember as a board member, we used a lot of different means of communication. Sending an email out to all parents just isn't effective. I mean, it's good to do. Some parents will use that, but you have to have other points of communication there, and using social media, all avenues of communication as you can. The other thing is, I would say to this person, as a board member, you might want to ask your own staff, what outreach are we doing to parents? If we have a middle school adoption, are we really reaching out to middle school organizations? Were we really talking to the parents in middle schools directly about what's coming? The PTOs, PTAs, as I've said earlier. So in that sense, I think it just requires a more active posture and communication.
Yes, and again, as I think the watchword for this whole webinar has been communication. And so thank you very much for that. So our final question is about advice. What advice do you trustee panelists have for how to balance teacher autonomy in choosing instructional materials with the local board's ultimate authority in approving instructional materials? And I don't know, Mike, if you want to chime in a little bit here as well about the requirements in the review process.
I can start off with that and pass things over to my fellow panelists. But yeah, there are requirements within local adoptions to ensure that voices are heard, whether they're the educators, the community, parents, et cetera. And so as Tom mentioned earlier, it's important for school boards to listen and to show that they're listening to their interest holders.
And Tom and Alma, do you want to weigh in here? This person is asking for your advice.
Is it advice? And I think I froze for a moment on teacher autonomy or on selecting the materials.
Balancing teacher autonomy in choosing instructional materials with the local board's ultimate authority in approving the instructional materials.
Yeah. I think, we opened the session today with talking about what have we learned from our experiences, and part of the learning in our experiences and in adopting materials has been the process and giving teachers an opportunity for that teacher-driven process, right? Which means that teachers have opportunities to bring forward the materials to the committee, and also to go through, as Tom shared, right, that piloting process. So I think it is important that we provide and we give voice to our teachers on their recommendations on some of the materials. And again, look at, building a little bit on what Tom shared, previous question about what is some information about the outreach that has been done through that communication, but what is some of the data that has been gathered that teachers, are putting forward to say, these are the materials that we've identified or we've selected, meaning, the pilot process, qualitative, quantitative data. So I think it's really important that we do value and, recognize the teachers as experts in their fields, and also in identifying what materials will be good for identifying the different needs or meeting the different needs of all students.
And I'll just say, look, good teachers are good teachers no matter what. Aristotle only needed a rock and a field, right? But things have changed a little since then. But I would say on your committee, you got to have teachers of a variety of experiences. You want your veteran teachers who can teach a class, handily. But you also need your teachers who are new to the profession and will be looking to these materials for more support. So you got to take into account, does it create the flexibility that the experienced teacher needs, and does it create the supports that the new teacher needs? The other thing you want to do is, in all this, you will look at research, you will look at materials, but keep in mind when it comes to parents, teachers, and students, the answer is in the room. There's no research that's going to magically drop from somewhere and tell you what to do. Everybody has to talk it through and be honest about their concerns, and those concerns have to be honored by everyone. So it's important. But I would just say this, in the end, avoid the labels and look at the evidence, because that's what you want to do. It's, what's working with our kids, what makes our teachers comfortable to teach, when a parent sees a book come home that they feel comfortable that it's their students are doing something worthwhile, and that it really is advancing their students' learning, that it's really speaking to the child's need and desire to learn. Because that's what we're here for, right? We're all here to support public education because it's one of the greatest things we have going in this country.
What a really wonderful note to end on. Thank you so much. That addresses all of the questions. I want to thank everyone for being here. I've learned a lot. I hope our participants have learned a lot. And I also want to remind everyone that we will be sharing the slides, and that at the CSBA website, there are other materials with many links, including to board policies, to help you with this process. So thank you so much, everyone.